It's been about 4 or 5 weeks now, at least, since we were able to have class on Ecclesiastes. So we're in the second chapter of the book, and just kind of briefly reviewing, we've talked about his efforts to find happiness in this life through the pleasures that can be found of it. We talked about his pursuit of pleasure, the pleasure of wine that he talked about, and we really began talking about his pleasure of material things. And he talks about through the things that he built. If you look in chapter 2, we'll begin there at verse 4 and just read through verse 6 about this. He said, I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. So he talks constantly about the things that he'd been building, all the projects that he had. And what would have been the greatest, perhaps, building project that he had? The temple. He spent 7 years that were spent on building this temple. This just gives you a picture of the model of it, what it was like, and the size of it. It's kind of hard to see on here, but up toward and this won't shine up there that far, but at the very top right there, if you can read that, it says American football field. That's just put in there to give you kind of a measure of size of the temple and what it was like. Give you some idea of the size of it. So it was tremendous building he'd built there, the temple. Like I said, it spent 7 years building it. And then this cutaway side of it, not just to show you the things inside the temple, but if you'll notice, the walls and the floors and everything in there, it's overlaid with gold. So just a magnificent structure that he built. And so this is one of the things, this is one of the works that he did, that he talks about, that he did, that he took great pleasure in. If you've ever had an opportunity to build a home for yourself, maybe had a chance to design it with what you wanted, have it exactly the way you want it, you know the joy that can bring to a person, and well, he's bragging here about what he has done here in all of the building works that he's done. Second thing here. Now, this is a schematic drawing of it. You see the temple there at the top, again put in place there, right here, and then the large court around that, and then the outer court here. Then over here is his palace that he built for himself. And so it's bigger than the temple itself, and not just his palace, but then attached to it, he built a place here for his wife that came from Egypt, Pharaoh's daughter. Then down below you had the throne room in it, and the pillar hall, and this outer court, and then you had the house called the Forest of Lebanon. And all of this was part of his home. And it took 13 years to build that. So almost twice as long to build it as it took to build the temple. And so all of these things that he had, that he talked about and he brags about, and when he talks about it here, in the section throughout where he talks about this, I think it's 32 different times he uses the word I, my, me, and mine. So he's boasting about all that he's done, all the things that he's built, and nobody before or since has been able to compare with all the things that he did, the structures that he built and came through. And it wasn't just these things that it talks about, but he talks about here about having great herds. Come on down, talk about the verse 7 and following. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, man's delight. All of the things that he talks about that he had, unlike anything that he had ever done before. I wonder if someone will turn over to 1 Kings chapter 4. I think we've mentioned this before, but for all that he had, all these people, all the servants that he had, all these things he provided for himself for his pleasure, and all the people that served there in his court, took quite a bit to feed that many people. In fact, in this passage here, 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 22 and 23, who's got that? Darnell, would you read that, please?
Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl.
That's how much he needed for one day to feed all his servants and people working there with him there as part of his court. That's hard to imagine that kind of food needed just for one day. And yet that's what it was. I mean, the type things that he had built and all the pleasures he provided for himself and all this food for everybody is just hard to believe. But that's what he had done for himself. And so he talks about all of these things that he had been able to imagine. And besides all of that, he talked about the gold and the silver that he had acquired. 2 Chronicles chapter 9 and verse 13. If someone look at that for us. 2 Chronicles 9:13. Who's got that for us? All right, Sarah, go ahead and read that.
Now the rate of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold.
Okay, 666 talents of gold in 1 year. Some translations say every year. So just think about that, 666 talents. Now that's dependent upon the size talent you're talking about. General, the talent was about 75 pounds. So you measure, multiply 666 by 75 to get how many pounds of gold he had coming in. And then measure that by the 12 ounces. I don't know how they would have gone back then, but in the troy ounces today for gold. Multiply that then by 12. And then multiply that by, I didn't check today to see, but gold's probably somewhere around $1,200 an ounce now. And the last time I looked this up, I just multiplied all that, and I came out with a total of $599,400,000 a year just in gold that were brought into his kingdom every year. So, you're over a $500 million right there in gold every year. And then as far as the silver is concerned, how much silver do you think? I don't believe it gives a specific amount, but when it talks about it, it just says that the supply of silver was such that the Bible says that silver was as common as stones in Israel. Now, I don't know about there, but Center Point, when I lived out there, stones were pretty prevalent, Try to go out there and mow the yard, and you end up a lot of times mowing rocks. But just think, silver would be as common, it says, as stones. And so the amount of wealth is just unbelievable that he had coming in there to them. And so again, that's something he talks about that nobody else, could compare with that in his day. He had the male and female singers that he talked about that he had for him. Most of us in our homes, we have some form of entertainment we have for ourselves, with TV, radio, stereo of some sort, all kinds of CD players and discs, something just for our entertainment. But he had live entertainment, and anytime he wanted it, he could call for it, and it was provided for him, for his own entertainment that had in all of that. And then, to add to his fulfillment of his sensual desires, he talks about he obtained for himself many concubines, the delight of men. According to 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 3, how many wives did Solomon have? You probably know this anyway. 700 wives and 300 concubines. It's just amazing to me to think about that and what he had. The number of concubines. In Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 8, this is the Young's literal translation of it. I gather for me also silver and gold and the peculiar treasures of kings and of the provinces. I prepared for me men singers and women singers and the luxuries of the sons of man, a wife and wives. That's literally the way it reads in the Hebrew. Wife and wives. Some of the other translations, and really trying to interpret for this, the RSV says, I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, man's delight. So again, all of this just for his pleasure, It wasn't necessarily his love for these women. That wasn't what motivated him. Just for his pleasure. And so he has sought out everything in the world imaginable to provide for his own pleasures, whatever it is that he wanted. And as he goes on, he talks about it here in the next few verses, verses 9 through 11. He says, "So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor. And this was my reward from all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun." In spite of all that he had, his conclusion to all of it is, it was all vanity, and it was a grasping for wind. It doesn't matter how many times we read this in the Bible and the conclusion he gets to, it's still hard for us to convince ourselves that if we had all the wealth that he had, we're able to build all that he built for himself that we could have all these pleasures, it's hard to convince people. You're not going to be happy with that, It's just hard to convince. We all have it seem like in our mind that those things are going to be necessary for my happiness. How much money? Every once in a while I'll read a story in the paper or somewhere about it, and the question will come up, how much money is necessary to make you happy? And if you ask a person that's making $10,000 a year, and he's going to say, well, I need at least $25,000. And a person that's making $25,000, he's got to make at least $50,000. And as you go up to each group, there's always more that they've got to have in order to be happy. And so, it's just, we can't convince ourselves until, if we do like Solomon, we try those things and fail, and it will, and you realize it won't make you happy. Yes, sir.
Went to a church with brain surgery, and he used to talk to people all the time. He'd say, if you make 5 figures a year, he said it's going to take 5 figures a year to do it.
That's right. Yeah. It's never going to. Yes, sir.
Rockefeller, as wealthy as he was, somebody asked him, says, "How much do you really want to accomplish wealth in your life?" Says, "Oh, just a little bit more."
Just a little bit more. And that's usually the way it is, isn't it? When I lived in Crossville, Tennessee, there were 5 of us preachers for the Church of Christ in the county. We shared a radio program. We'd take it about a month at a time. The congregations, most of them, there were small churches, well under 100. But the major congregation there in Crossville itself, Main Street, they had probably close to 500. And so, we'd get together sometimes and we would share sermon outlines and different things, as well as sharing the radio program. And a lot of times they'd kid the man who was preaching there at the Main Street, because he had such a large congregation and knew he made a good bit more money than the rest of us. And they were kidding him about that, and he pulled his wallet out and opened it up, and it was empty. And I think that gets to that point. How much you make, you spend that much. And so you're never happy because you never have money to do anything else. You're spending it all. And so Solomon is doing that. And yet he admits, hey, this doesn't bring that happiness and that contentment that I thought it would. And so as he says about it, no king or any of the rich who came before him had been able to excel what Solomon did in his pursuit of pleasure. Nobody had ever been able to do that. He's gone farther than anybody else and done more and gained more, but he's still not happy with it. And he says during all this time, he made the statement that while his wisdom was still with him. Now, I think there's a real possibility that the wisdom he's talking about there is not that wisdom that God gave him, a spiritual wisdom, but I think it's the worldly wisdom. Things that he learned out in the world and so forth, and that wisdom is still with him, and that's why he keeps pursuing all these things, and yet he's always disappointed in it. And yet it says all of his toil, of all of his works, and the pursuit of pleasure proved to be a vanity and a striving after wind. And Brother Burton Kaufman pointed out that, quote, many another profligate playboy has tragically discovered the same truth. Anybody that's ever tried pursuing that way for happiness is always going to come out the same. It's not going to provide that satisfaction that they need. And that's the way it's been for him here. He did everything. Anything his eyes desired, he would go for it. Didn't keep him away from it. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. Now that's scary to think about. It may be other things that he's involved in that he doesn't talk about here. But just sums it all up. If there's any pleasure that you can think of, he said, I didn't keep back from any of it. And yet, for all of that, he said, when I got through with that and I looked at all these things that I built, all this wealth that I've accumulated, all of these fantastic things I have, he said, it's all vain. It's all worthless. It's all grasping for wind. How successful can you be in grabbing the wind? You can't do it. And that's what he's saying. It's all futile. There's simply no ways you can ever find that happiness and that contentment in life by pursuing after these things. And so he says, continuing on that, then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. In spite of all the wisdom that he had, he said he's no better off than the fool was. And that's always going to be the case when you're doing it like this. He reaches this conclusion, though. He says, wisdom is better than foolishness. He made that statement there in verse 13. I saw that wisdom excels folly, he says, as light excels darkness. Now, how much better is light than darkness? Matt, sir? Infinitely better. Why? Okay, just being able to see. You know, Jesus talks about that in the New Testament, about this idea of walking in light as opposed to walking in darkness. Those that are in sin, he says, are walking in darkness. It's only those who are obedient to God, who submit to his will, are those who are walking in light. And so he makes it clear. He says, the wise man, that's better. And wisdom excels foolishness, just like darkness or light excels darkness. And yet, even so, he still feels this futility in all of this, that though he's not learned anything. The wise man, number one, can see where he's going, but the fool is like a blind man who cannot see, and so he stumbles. John chapter 11, 9 and 10. Jesus talks about those who walk in darkness and those who walk in light. And that's the problem. Those who walk in darkness can't see, and they're going to stumble. Spiritually talking about, those that walk in darkness are those people who are going to stumble into sin. They're going to fail. It's only those who are willing to come to the light, to come to Christ, and to live as he wants them to live, to follow his will. They're walking in light. And because of that, they'll be able to succeed. And so, wisdom is greater than foolishness. But as he talks about it here, the wise man, even though he's better than the foolish man, the end result's going to be the same. What's going to happen to them? They're both going to die. So what benefit then is wisdom in that regard? They're both going to meet the same. Hey, I've spent all this time, I've gained all this wealth, I've gained all these things for myself, I've built all these beautiful buildings for my pleasure, and yet I'm going to die just like the fool out here that doesn't have anything. And so, again, he says, this is vanity. All that I've done has been in vain. It's been worthless. Now, I think when you keep hearing this over and over again from Solomon, you understand why the non-believers, those who are atheistic or even agnostic, they're the ones who love the book of Ecclesiastes, because they love this idea that life is vain. It's all worthless. It doesn't matter what you do or how you live. You're all going to come to the same end. You're all going to die. you're no better off than the beast, and he's going to get to that later also, that you're all going to die. And so, all the wealth that you have and obtained, what's going to happen to that wealth when you die? Yeah, it's going to be passed on to somebody else. And this is the thing that really seems to irk Solomon. How did he get all this wealth? Well, Solomon will tell you, I labored for all of this. I worked at this. Became successful in gaining all of this. And but what good did it do me? Because when I die, who knows but what my wealth doesn't go to somebody that's a fool who's never done anything. And people complain about that a lot here in America. Where do they feel like most wealth comes from? And families today, the wealthy families in our nation, for the most part, where do they get that wealth? Huh? From their ancestors. They inherited it, And so somebody had some ancestors that really worked hard and diligently and became successful and gained a lot of wealth. And then when they died, what happened to it? Well, it was passed on to the relatives. And, those relatives didn't do a thing to gain that wealth. They didn't have to work and labor and slave to gain that. It was just left to them by them. So that's the thing that he's getting to here. And he says, for there's no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever. Since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die as the fool? Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me. For all is vanity and grasping for wind. There it is again. It just really bothers Solomon that he could spend all that time and all that effort to gain all these things, to build all these things, and yet he's still going to die. And somebody else is going to gain all that wealth that he had. And all he says that I've done is going to be forgotten. Well, that's probably true for most people. But it's not really true for Solomon, because God's recorded all of these things that Solomon's done in his word, the Bible. And that's going to last forever. But for normal people, you may be remembered for a while, but not for eternity. Are you going to be remembered? If somebody were to ask me who my grandparents were, I couldn't tell you. I know my maternal grandmother. She died when I was about 4. But I have vague memories of her. But the rest of them, I don't know at all. Didn't know them. So it's like he says. All's going to be forgotten in the days to come. And so what's going to happen to the wise man? He's going to die just like the fool. And so he's not going to be remembered in that sense. For the most part, he will not be. And so he talks about this idea between the wise man and the fool. Wisdom is better than foolishness, but look at it. The wise man's life ends at death. The foolish man's life ends at death. No better for the wise than for the fool. When the wise man dies, he works hard to obtain wealth, but he dies and leaves all of his wealth behind. Somebody else gets it. The foolish man, lazy, does not work, but maybe he inherits all that wealth left by the rich man who dies. And so, all that work, all that effort, he said, all of that was vain. That was just a grasping for wind. It didn't mean anything. Now, in these next few verses, Solomon speaks as though he's thinking about his son Rehoboam. That's verses 21 to 23 here in chapter 2. He says, because sometimes a man who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave all to be enjoyed by a man who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and great evil. What is a man from all the toil and strain with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of pain, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his mind does not rest. This also is vanity. Who was Solomon's son that he's talking about? Rehoboam. Now stop and think. What kind of a man was Rehoboam? What happened to him when he became king? It went to his head, but what happened as a result of all that? Yeah, and it ended in the kingdom being divided. You know, he didn't listen to the older men, the wiser men, to give him some encouragement of what he needed to do, but he listened to the young men, those his own age. And so, you know, some had said to him, you know, your father laid all these taxes on us. And, you know, if you will just reduce these taxes, then the people will love you and they'll follow you always. And that's what the wise men, the older men, told him. Then he went to the younger men, those of his own age, and asked them what advice they would give. And they'd say, hey, you tell the people, if you think my daddy put a burden on you, he said, what my daddy put on you, you know, that's like a little finger compared to my thigh. You know, I'm going to make it harder on you. I'm going to put more taxes on you. Well, what did that do? Well, that immediately caused a rebellion among the people, and it divided the kingdom. And Rehoboam soon led the people off into idolatry. He wasted everything that he had. You know, he behaved and lived as a fool. And that's kind of what Solomon was concerned about. You know, what's going to happen to all this that I've done when I die, and it's going to be left to somebody else. Sometimes that's going to happen. What you leave behind will be wasted by those who get it. And Solomon was concerned about, and that was just one of the things he worried about. He talks about how that even at night he couldn't sleep. He said, what is a man from all the toil and strain with which he toils beneath the sun? And then verse 23, for all his days are full of pain, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his mind does not rest. This also is vanity. I think what Solomon is talking about there is, you know, that you've gained all this great wealth and abundance of it, and you can't sleep at night because you're worried about that wealth and what's going to happen to it. You know, if you got a bank account that just has $1 in it, you're not really worried about if somebody steals that. But if you are a millionaire and you've got all this money, then you are concerned about it. Why do so many people pay money to LifeLock? Why do they do that? Huh? Protecting what you've got. Protect your identity. And in doing that, protecting whatever wealth you have. Somebody steals your identity, and next thing you know, they are just spending all your money. And it is an extremely difficult thing, evidently, to stop it. To convince somebody that's not you, that's your money, and that's not whoever's got this to spend it. People worry about things like that. And I think that's the way it was with Solomon here. He's concerned about and worried about what's going to happen to that wealth that he's got, so that he can't even rest well at night. And yet we have the very opposite idea. You know, we think sometimes, boy, if I had enough money, whatever amount it might be in your mind, then I don't have to worry about, you know, buying food for my family, buying clothing, paying for a house. I can pay for all the utilities. I don't have to worry about that. I got enough money to take care of all that. And so I can sleep well at night. No, it gets to the point, Solomon says, when you can't rest at night because you're concerned about all that money you've got and what's going to happen to it. And so, and like again, he speaks here like he's talking about Rehoboam, and he's concerned about what's going to happen and what Rehoboam's going to do with all that wealth. And Rehoboam, what he did was to behave more like a fool than a wise man, and all of Solomon's efforts in gaining all that wealth and everything proves to be worthless. Again, talks about that. It's all vanity and a grasping after wind. And so the more wealth that he gained, the more he worried about losing it. And that's the passage you just looked at through 23. Worried about losing that wealth that he might have. Throughout the second chapter, Solomon talks about the money that he has and all that he's done. And it's interesting here, the problem about it. He seeks this wealth for his own benefit and not for God's glory. And here's where the problem comes in. Now, we know the New Testament teaches about money, that what is it about money that's the root of all evil? The love of money. It's not money itself, but it's that love of money. And why would people love money? Why do people want more money? They want things? Yeah, whatever they can buy, with that money. Things they'd love to have. If you got the money, I can buy it. And so there are a lot of people like that. What other reasons might a person have for wanting more money? Sir? Prestige, that comes with that, and the power, and people recognize you and they know your name. I'm thinking of a good reason. Sir? Security? Yeah, again, for yourself and your family, you don't have to worry about anything. Some people are, boy, what if I get, a debilitating disease and I can't work anymore? And what's going to happen to my family? What if, you have a situation like with Ray passing away? You lose the breadwinner in the family, and what am I going to do now? So, they look for security. But I'm thinking of something on a positive note. Why some people might want more money. What? To help. More money, I can do more good. And there have been people like that. There are some people who inherited millions of dollars from their families, who started businesses, became very successful, and the kids had nothing to do with it, and they gained all this money, and they become philanthropists. I started to be like the Wizard of Oz there for a minute. Good deed doers. But there are people like that whose desire for money is so they can help more people with it. There are people who love to be able to spend money on research to find cures for different diseases, and will give away millions of dollars for things like that. But Solomon never seemed to have any real concerns about that and about serving God and pleasing God. He seemed to be concerned most of all for himself. Like we talked about over and over again, he kept talking about himself and all. And all of these things that he did primarily for his benefit and not for God's glory. I was thinking I'd put down here somewhere about that. Let me see. Okay. Here's what, again, Brother Burton Kaufman, I quoted him here. He said, it seems never to have occurred to Solomon that he should have made himself rich toward God with all that wealth. You remember when Jesus talked about the rich man in Luke chapter 12, verses 16 and 21? Look at this. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Isn't that what Solomon did? He kept talking about all these things that he did in reference to himself, for his pleasure, for his enjoyment, all of these things. And never once thought about, the needs of other people. He was never rich toward God in that respect. And so, that's the thing here about him that we need to look at. Again, just comparing the two, Solomon and that rich man in Luke chapter 12. Solomon spoke of himself 65 times in 26 verses. Look here. 65 times he's talking about himself. The rich man in Luke 12 wasn't quite that bad. He spoke of himself 11 times in 3 verses. He kept talking about, me and mine and so forth. Solomon had the attitude, get wealth and enjoy yourself as much as you can. And that's what he was doing, trying to find that happiness, that contentment in life through all of that. The rich man of Luke 12 had the attitude, eat, drink, and be merry. And there are a lot of people that live their lives in that way. That's why they're here. It's just to enjoy themselves in any and every way they can. The end of Solomon was death. The end of that rich man in Luke 12, death. Jesus said, today shall thy soul be required of thee. Now, your life is being required. And all the wealth that Solomon had was left to another person. And all the wealth of this rich man is left to someone else too. It's all gone from them. And that's the way it is when all we're concerned about is gaining all this, having all this for my pleasure. And never thinking about how can I use what God's given me to help other people. What can I do with what God's given me in order to bring glory and honor to God and to serve God as I should? And that's the whole thing about it. And I think Kaufman was right when he said that Solomon never was rich toward God. Never even thought about that in this respect. And then finally, the fact that Solomon recognizes that no one can find true happiness or satisfaction without God. Now, that's the rendering that's given in the Revised Standard. And I like that. I think that's the whole gist of it. That no one can eat or have enjoyment without God. And that's a lesson to every one of us. We need to make sure that God is in our lives in a real way. That we're living for Him and serving Him and doing what He wants to do. Because without God, there's not going to be able to be that enjoyment, that happiness that we need. Look at verse 24. He says, there's nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. That's the same as that rich man of Luke 12. But then in verse 25 he says, 24 and 25, this also I saw is from the hand of God, for apart from Him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? Now that's different from some of the other translations. Darnell, I know you've got several different translations there. What translation are you using there? Yeah, the English Standard is pretty much the same as RSV in a lot of this. That's verse, primarily, well, it's verses 24 and 25.
Okay, and the CEV says the best thing we can do is to enjoy eating, drinking, and working. I believe these are God's gifts to us. And no one enjoys eating and doing more than I do.
Okay. That's what, nobody enjoys eating and drinking more than I do, Solomon says. But I like the rendering given here in the RSV. For apart from Him, that is from God, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? And the clear answer to that is no one can. No one can have true enjoyment in this life apart from God. If God's not a part of your life, there's no happiness to be found there. And that's always proven to be true. All of the wealth that Solomon possessed couldn't bring him happiness. In spite of it all, he said it's all vain, it's all worthless, it's grasping for wind. Why? Because that's all he has. He doesn't have God in his life. Now, you look at the lesson I talked about last Sunday morning about the church there at Laodicea. And Dan's the one who gave the name for Laodicea, the church that had everything except Christ. They had all kinds of wealth. They didn't have Jesus anymore. They shoved Him out. And when that happens, there's no joy to be found in the life of a person. You cannot be happy. Don't deceive yourself into thinking, if I can have all this wealth like Solomon had, and there's nothing in the world that cause me to be sad. I'm going to be happy. That's not the case. You're not going to have it. The poorest man that ever lived can know true joy and happiness if he's living for God, if he's got God in his life. A couple of verses here. Luke chapter 12 and verse 15. Jesus said, beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. You believe that? I know what you're going to say. Sure I do. Christ said it. I believe everything Christ said. But then when we get in that situation, money becomes involved and all of a sudden things change. Proverbs 13:22. Solomon said, "A good man leaveth an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the righteous." You know, those people that are just out just to gain wealth for themselves, they're not going to be happy with it. It's not going to help them out. I got a couple examples that I found in some research on it. One of these is Boris Becker. I don't know, any of y'all know Boris Becker? Not personally, but know who he is. A tennis player. He was from Germany. He made this statement one time and talking about his life and about how he had gotten to the point where he was considering suicide. And he said, "I had won Wimbledon twice before, once as the youngest player to ever win it. I was rich. I had all the material possessions I needed. It's the old song of movie stars and pop stars who commit suicide. They have everything and yet they are so unhappy. I had no inner peace. I was a puppet on a string." You know, he's got wealth, he's got fame, he's a star athlete, but on the brink, he said, of suicide. Jack Higgins. How many of you ever heard of Jack Higgins? Oh, you have, surely. Jack Higgins is an author. He wrote The Eagle Has Landed. My favorite book by him was The Valhalla Exchange. I've got that in my library. If you'd like to visit, read that. It's a good novel. He's an excellent writer. But Jack Higgins made this statement. He was asked one time what he would have liked to have known as a boy. And his answer was that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. You know, all that striving for success, became a successful author, has won numerous prizes, sold millions of copies of books, has all kinds of money, and yet he says, when I got to the top, nothing there. It's the same thing that Solomon's talking about. It's all vanity. It's a grasping after wind. It just doesn't bring what you're hoping for, what you're looking for. All right, so that's basically all that he's gone through here in chapter 2. All of that pursuit for happiness and wealth and pleasure of any and every kind, and he just doesn't find it. So when you get to chapter 3, it's going to be the vanity of our short life. That's basically the idea about it. And what's going on here, Solomon's going to list 14 of the common events in life. And every one of us are familiar with these things. And yet he does it not to approve or condemn of them, but only to emphasize that all of these events in life are worthless without God in our lives. If we don't have God, all of this is worthless. There's a time when all of these things are going to happen to us one time or another, the good things and the bad things. And it seems like, as he points out, that seems like for every good thing that happens to your life, something bad happens to you. Life isn't a straight, level plane. It's up and down, up and down. And every time you have something good, you can expect eventually something bad is going to happen. It's just the way it's going to be. So what determines the issues of human life? You know, if it's not in the wealth and knowledge you have, what is it? And so here are 7 different things that have been listed that really have determined your life and how it's going to be for you. Number 1, the age into which one is born. Have you ever stopped and thought about what it would have been like if you'd been born at a different age and time? And maybe, as it also points out, you're born in a different place. You know, there'd be places where you would never hear a thing about God, never know anything about Jesus. And what kind of a difference would that make in your life? It also has to do with the standard in which you're born, you know, the money that you might have been born to, as to what your life would be like. Several other things, just mention these quickly because our time's gone. It also has to do with the ability or the health of you or your parents, their religion or lack of it, whether there prevailed war or peace, what the social climate or geographical conditions were like, the presence or absence of physical or mental handicaps, all kinds of accidents which may either enhance or hinder one's efforts to succeed. All such things like that can happen. And your success or failure is going to be determined primarily by your relationship with God and how that ends. So what we're going to do next week, we'll begin there in chapter 3, and he's going to go through those 14 things. And those remember, time to be born and time to die. Singing next week. Boy, 5 weeks off, we get back and then we're off again. Okay. Singing next week, 2 weeks. We'll begin here at this point in chapter 3. Let's have a brief word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, we pray you would help us and understand fully your word as we read and study through it. And Father, not just to understand it and know it mentally, but to accept it into our own lives and live by it. We pray you'll dismiss us in your care and please bless us and keep us safe and allow us to be back here, Father, this coming Sunday. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.